Okay. Okay, I think we're up and running. So yeah, the Pathwork lectures, came in through a medium by the name of Eva Paracas, and this one is dated April 14, 1961. She began channeling these particular, like it's a series of 258 of them, and she began in 1957, I believe, and then she passed away in like 1978. So the lectures, are she would give, frequently, and there would be people that would be asking questions sometimes, or and a group of people that would be present during the transmission, and then also she would send them out and work on these written versions of them. So this is an edition that was also, she was German, and so some of her English syntax was a little tricky, and so people found sometimes it was easier to understand the lectures in this edited version, but they're both good, and so we do this for convenience because this is sort of what they're mostly published in on the International Pathwork site, and you can look and read all of them that are available, and they are vast and cover a lot. And as you read them, like you begin to see sort of like each facet is like the facet of of one diamond, right? And you begin to get the larger picture. But this particular lecture and the two before it, are very important, seminal lectures. And the first two before it, it's not necessary that you read these lectures in order. I mean, they're all connected in some ways, right? And they all stand alone. But we were sort of reading this series, and I thought it was interesting that this came next, and I hadn't really realized how connected it is. And yet, in my own work with people, that is what I've exactly realized. Oh, this is part of that foundation. So it was just an interesting confirmation for me. And then, the guide is talking about duality, right? And the fact that we have this fundamental difficulty of, pleasure versus pain, life versus death. And then we have difficulty sort of embracing all of life, and and the unconscious levels of us oftentimes we're more involved in sort of trying to avoid death than actually saying yes to life. And that creates its own difficulties. And that's where he's going here with this idealized self-image, because this is our pseudo solution, our attempt to somehow avoid various deaths that we're trying to, and so we try to control ourselves and make ourselves be a certain way. And the result is a lot of suffering and pain out of that. So here we go. The idealized self-image. It says, greetings. God bless all of you, my dearest friends. Welcome are all my old and new friends gathered here. Let us continue within the series of lectures to help you gain further insight into yourself and therefore into life. The two preceding lectures dealt with the great duality, the struggle between life and death, the illusion that it is a question of either or. So the more one is involved in duality, and the more one sees life in terms of extremes, such as happiness versus unhappiness, with happiness standing for life and unhappiness for death. And we struggle in this duality, and then it's impossible to accept life as necessarily containing both. And, this is such a beautiful thing in the pathwork, because we all go through difficulties, and, to understand that it's a part of the spiritual journey, and that's not something, that we could or should avoid, we can learn from and grow from. But, to begin to realize that we can welcome and understand the value of all of it. So somebody just joined us. Welcome. Do you want to just introduce yourself? Or was it you, Jacob?
Hey, just Jacob.
Okay, you just bounced out. Okay. All right.
Right.
Okay, thanks. So So he's saying, while struggling in this duality, it is impossible to accept life as necessarily containing both. And intellectually, we might know that, right? And believe that, but emotionally, we do not. And if you study your feelings very closely, you will see, that basically what you feel is that if you are unhappy now, you will continue to be unhappy forever. There's this kind of, awfulizing and generalizing, that there's a tragic, unnecessary, and destructive struggle that we kind of mount against death or unhappiness. And it's kind of like that becomes a vicious circle. And actually the struggle against the death or unhappiness brings us into more of that, and we miss out on more of the life and the goodness. So this lecture is sort of a deeper understanding of this in the inner psyche, and how we unconsciously turn against ourselves in order to try to protect ourselves. And to understand that, is to redo that in a sense, right? And realize that we need to, hold ourselves and be with what life offers in a certain way. And there's a different form of protection rather than a defense. So he goes on now to explain how all of this happens and how it gets set in the psyche. Birth is a painful experience for the infant. Other painful experiences are bound to follow, although pleasurable experiences occur as well. But since the knowledge of unpleasurable experiences or their possibility is always present, the fear of them creates a basic problem. And then the most significant countermeasure that we resort to in the false belief that it will sort of avoid that unhappiness and pleasure and death is we create an idealized self-image as a universal pseudo-protection. So it's like, if only I was this way, then life would be wonderful or something like that, and then we refine it in various ways, and we, but there is this kind of seeking, for like, if we could just be perfect enough or how we think, we need to be, then we would be able to be safe, we would be able to find happiness or, love. And so by creating this image of a self that we think will please everybody and give us what we need, then we end up, sort of betraying our real self and trying to live up to this image. So he goes on and he says, they never realize that this very countermeasure not only does not avoid, but rather brings on the various thing that they dread most and fight. So he says he's occasionally used the term mass self in the past, and the mass self and the idealized image are really one and the same, because the idealized self masks the real self. It pretends to be something you are not. The idealized self-image is supposed to be a means of avoiding unhappiness. Since unhappiness automatically robs the child of security, its self-confidence is diminished in proportion to its unhappiness. I just had a recent situation with that. We're doing some inspections on this property, and it's a big deal. We're spending a lot of money, and it's big risk for several people involved and like that. And so, trying to get these inspections, and I was sort of spearheading all of that and thought I had it in place, and then one of them fell through, and kind of like there was this sort of, I could feel this sense of unhappiness descend, and it was connected to, like I thought I had it all together, and then it didn't work out, and what happened, and what, how am I wrong or something. So, I could feel that energy, kind of covering over me, that is this way that it helps when we can identify, this idealized self-image. So, in the old days, I would have gotten lost in it and thrashed around in it for days and days and days. Now it's much quicker, process of returning to sort of the core and the center and, the truth and the real self. So he says, yeah.
Would you be willing to share what the self-image that you got in touch with is?
Well, for me, he's saying here, I don't think you even have to identify. This is where, I think, we teach it in certain ways, but people need to broaden their concept. So, I wouldn't say that the self-image was a love man, I'm not like, but what I'm aware of is what he's saying there. Like I somehow, felt that since it didn't turn out, maybe somehow I had not done it well. Right. And that sense of diminishment, of security and self-confidence, right, brought in a kind of a vague state of unhappiness and sort of self-judgment. I could feel a little in the background with it, and I knew I'm in a place now where I don't, I can hold that and I don't, get lost in it. But I couldn't automatically dispel it. I had to, be sitting with it, and like every once in a while, a flash of it would come through, and I could feel this old feeling in me from a long time ago. Whenever those thought forms that were the thought forms of me falling short in some way of whatever it doesn't really matter what it is, right? It's like it's less important to really totally identify that. Sometimes it's useful. But to recognize that it's active in you, because whatever it is, we, once we can consciously be aware of it, we can do some damage control. So Judy's joining us. So welcome, Judy. So we're just going into the lecture, talking about the idealized self. So glad you could join us.
Hi, Darlene.
Okay, so you want to share anything? You did get a chance to read the lecture, or you want to just continue listening in? Okay, I'll take that as a continue listening. Okay, so yeah, Dick was asking a question about a story that I was sharing, and just sort of recognizing the presence of this, dissatisfaction, right? And this is, the Buddhists call it dukkha, right? It's a spiritual, recognition of a state of consciousness, right? That is, we can never be satisfied from this place, right? So it's good just to recognize its signature, and then, to hold a deeper truth, because it's kind of like an inner accuser, right? Usually the ISI is that, it's somehow accusing you that you didn't do it good enough or right enough or well enough or, whatever, right? So does that help, Dick? Is that...
Well, it kind of goes against what I've read for many lectures, that the deeper and the more specific one can get into the source, then one can release it, as opposed to what I think what you're saying is a general feeling of the original source. So I'm a little confused.
I understand that, and I would say that there might be some developments and understandings, right? And the guide always does try to say, try to bring it as conscious as possible, right? But for me, to understand, to try to work it just conceptually, so I have to go into the energy, right? The energy will give me the information, right? And then, it's like the energy sense of it is probably more nuanced than any language that I could put on it, right? And also I think it is. It's going to show up in all of these myriad ways, because it kind of is overtaking us, right? And it, it shows up in many forms. So yes, it's good to know, our, like the category of the mask that he goes into, and what is your main mask, but he also says we all have all of them, right? So in another lecture around this, he talks about the three qualities of the higher self, love, power, and serenity, being sort of unconsciously one of those is adapted as the pseudo solution to life's problems. So in the childhood, the child might think, well, if only I'm perfectly loving, everybody will take care of me and take care of my needs and I'll be okay. And so I have to become what everybody else wants me to be, right? And that's a distortion of love, which it's kind of like reflective maybe of the higher self quality of service and helping each other kind of thing, but it comes from this place of fear and manipulation, right? And so it's trying to resolve life's problems with this overgeneralization of being a good girl or a good little boy. The next level, is the quality of power, and that's a self-empowerment, right? But in its distorted mask level, the child sees and thinks, well, if only I were perfectly powerful, nobody could hurt me or abuse me or, take advantage of me or whatever. And so sometimes children, try to be tough, try to not be, letting their feelings show and not be, soft or weak, because their idealized self says that's, the love mask is, wimpy, right? And you got to be powerful instead. And that's an interesting thing because the three divine qualities, when they're in together, they're in harmony, right? So love, power, and serenity function as a, beautiful harmony in the higher self. But when they are operating as a defense against life's difficulties. And so the final one, if love and power doesn't work, we go to serenity, which in its distorted level is withdrawal. So you would, just kind of rise above it all, right? And try to not feel and, just be bigger than all of it. And again, these things are, there's truth in their ultimate spiritual realization, but we're trying to jump over the growth and the development process to get to the true spiritual embodiment of those qualities. And instead, we're trying to control ourselves to act as if we were loving, act as if we were powerful, act as if we were cool and serene, right? And so the act is what makes it the mask, and the mask is sort of determined by sort of our belief about what will protect us. Any other questions on that? Because I know we're going, to some of the other lectures, and this is a big topic. So people still with me?
I just
Yep.
wanted to say that I Googled, I didn't know how to spell it, but luckily Google accommodates that, the Buddhist concept of dukkha.
Uh-huh.
And it definitely is in alignment with this lecture.
Yeah.
And I thought about it. You and I spoke earlier today, and I was mentioning a psychologist friend who is also Buddhist. And so many ways that she addresses things align with Buddhism. And that's a whole interesting concept right there. But when I looked at the, I guess, 5 concepts of dukkha, according to Google University, it goes right along with what you're saying here. And it starts with birth. And then it goes to aging, illness, and death. So it follows the whole,
Exactly.
lecture.
Right, and the two preceding that are even, also more involved in this issue of, the problem with life is that we get old and die and we suffer in between, right? And we can't seem to come to terms with that very well, right? And then we struggle against it. And then that struggle against it ends up making it even a tougher journey than it would be, with a kind of deeper surrender and wisdom, but you can't just pretend to do that, right? So that's the work, right? That's the inner work that we do. So great, thank you. Anything more? Were you finished?
Well, I mean, of course, every point that everyone brings up could be a lecture, but it could become a whole lecture. But the whole, one of the five, I guess, tenets, I guess I will say, of dukkha is not getting what is wanted. So that's what you were saying with the inspection, and then the masks and the truth and reality. And it just kind of dawned on me that one of the things that my friend says all the time is seeing, accepting, and releasing. So if you really believe in the idea of dukkha and the idea of these maskings and unmaskings and so forth, it's more of what we think should happen because of what we put into an act, which is something that I go through constantly. You know, if you're type A, if you're a perfectionist and all of this kind of thing, you measure life as to what you put in. And, you know, a lot of things in society are built that way. Students measure themselves by GPAs. Adults measure themselves by credit reports.
Right.
You know, it's all of this kind of thing. And when your whole life is set up to, you know, spend time creating it and then get the result of it, if you're not getting what you think you put in, it's just devastating, and it creates all of this. So it was just kind of very interesting that you brought up the whole concept of dukkha in alignment with what this is talking about.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I find, you know, most of the spiritual truths, if you find it in one place, you will find it in all of them in some form, right? You know, and it does, I find for myself anyway, help to, you know, see their different reflections back, and also to me confirms their validity, right? You know, and so yeah. And this one, I think the way the guide presents it, you know, then adds, you know, maybe some depth. You know, I haven't studied the Buddhist tradition all the way with this, right? But certainly, you know, as I deepen into what the guide is offering here, you know, he's trying to help us unravel it, right? So we can step out of that. And again, it's not easy. It's like you're saying, it's pervasive in our culture. In some ways, we're talking simply about ego consciousness, right? And we are all, you know, we were raised in it, you know, we've been, you know, conditioned to, you know, think and perceive through this system. And so it does take this deep self-examination, which can also be done through meditation, other practices, but the guide kind of brings it more into a community practice and into a, you know, like a more of a conceptual awareness. And then we also do some deep work with emotional stuff. So, so he says, you know, we need to grasp the significance, the effects, and the damages that follow in the wake of the idealized self-image, because otherwise we think it's our savior, you know, we think it's our true inner authority in some ways, right? And we can't resist it, you know, it just seems to be ultimate truth. So we have to really recognize that it's while it subtly contains truth often, which allows us to think, you know, yes, this must be what's true. It always comes with a distortion, right? You know, like they say the higher self will speak truth and whisper it to us with great love and respect, and just a kind of invitation or suggestion or offering. Whereas the idealized self, you know, its whole purpose is control, right? And it has a demand or a forcing current energy with it, and it has oftentimes punishment or judgment with it. And so where we end up feeling the consciousness inside of us is attacking ourselves with, you know, these energies, you know, and begin to recognize how it makes us feel, you know, like on one level, yes, we should be better, but, you know, and then we feel the part that's being, you know, chastised, and it feels terrible. And we wonder why we feel so unhappy. So it's kind of like we create our own internalized top dog parental consciousness that we project out as, you know, ultimate authority. And it, you know, often has a lot of what our parents would tell us. And then it comes at us in this parental authority place that our inner child either feels, bad and buckles down, or feels rebellious and, just resists. And sometimes both, and often unconsciously. So we don't understand why life is happening the way it is, but it's actually our own inner self shutting down against the barrage of, condemnation by this part of ourselves. And I think that's the source of a lot of depression and other things that we get into. So he says the dissolution of the idealized self is the only possible way to find your true self, to find serenity and self-respect, and to live your life fully. So he comes back into sort of the initial conditions, right? So he says, as a child, regardless of what your particular circumstances were, you were indoctrinated with admonitions on the importance of being good, holy, perfect. When you were not, you were often punished in one way or another. Perhaps the worst punishment was that your parents withdrew their affection from you. They were angry, and you had the impression you were no longer loved. No wonder badness associated itself with punishment and unhappiness, and goodness with reward and happiness. Hence, to be good and perfect became an absolute must. It became a question of life or death for you. And so this is, important, like that, where we feel like, we have to do something, or somehow we would die if we didn't, right? Somehow emotional death, some kind of inner feeling of, I couldn't stand it, I couldn't live through it, right? That tells us we're in this territory of the idealized self-image. And he says, still, you knew perfectly well that you were not as good and perfect as it would seem is expected of you, right? And so you had to hide this truth, and it becomes a guilty secret. And then you start to build this false self. And what you thought then was your protection and your means of attaining what you desperately wanted, life, happiness, security, self-confidence, this awareness of the false front sort of begin to vanish, but you are permanently sort of in the unconscious aware, and so there's a kind of guilt for pretending to be something that we are not. And then we strain harder and harder to embody it, to become it, which is somewhat of our own higher self, because we came here, right, to try to evolve, to grow, to, become more, but from this strain and this forcing current, and from this, judgment and rejection of where we are now, we cannot possibly grow, right? And so, it becomes this vicious circle of straining harder and harder and getting less and less results, and having to strain harder and harder. And then we finally break down, and physically or mentally or some way, right? He says, you were and unconsciously still are convinced that if you strain hard enough, one day you will be that perfect self that you think you need to be in order to win whatever, the goodness in life is that you want. But this artificial squeezing into something you are not process can never attain genuine self-improvement, self-purification, and growth. Because you started building on an unreal self, on a false foundation, and you're leaving your real self out. In fact, you are desperately hiding it. So the idealized self-image may assume many forms. It does not always dictate standards of recognized perfection. Yes, much of the idealized self-image dictates highly moral standards. This is why we really believe it's the voice of God, or the, our highest authority somehow. We don't notice the energy behind it that makes that suspect. So, it often masquerades as, this very high idealized, version, and making it all the more difficult then to question its validity. Like, isn't it right to always want to be decent, loving, understanding, never angry, to have no faults, and to try to attain perfection? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? And he says, such considerations will make it difficult for you to discover the compulsive attitude that denies present imperfection. In this is pride, lack of humility that prevents you from accepting yourself as you are now. And above all, the pretense with its resulting shame, fear of exposure, secretiveness, tension, strain, guilt, and anxiety, right? He says it will take some progress in this work before you begin to experience the difference in feeling between the genuine desire to gradually work toward growth and the ungenuine pretense imposed upon you by the dictates of your idealized self. You will discover the deeply hidden fear that says your world will come to an end if you do not live up to its standards. So let me pause here a minute and open it up. Anybody want to comment here? How's this landing?
Well, I'll jump in if nobody else is. Your last comment on the world will come to an end. For me, it looks like if I'm really my authentic self, which is in a way more shy, I think, in some ways, and I'm more reserved, that I will lose all friends and I will be abandoned and the world will come to an end. If I don't become this extrovert, in social situations. So it's a very real statement for me, and it's a real precarious walk to try to.
Right. Great. Yeah. So, a good example. And then, in some way, I mean, it feels very real. It always does, it's like exactly like that, different versions of it, and so then the question is, how do we challenge it? Because it's like, this is where it feels like the shaman's death. We have to jump off that cliff. We have to face that belief that, everything will, we'll lose everything that we want in some way, right? And yet, the guide says when we are willing and we can do that, and it takes a while to get to that point. He's not just saying push yourself off the cliff. Again, that's another kind of, you have to walk with yourself, at a certain pace that your own inner being has, right, and can process and integrate this stuff, and you want to be in support of it. You're not the forcing current, you're not the judge. You want to befriend yourself and trust, that your real self, has what it needs to, walk through this, and so we have to develop this deeper respect and trust in this, and then at some point, we can risk these big deaths, right? That seem like, the world would come to an end. And what we usually find, and sometimes life just throws us off the cliff, when we're ready, and sometimes we come to that place, is that we don't die, right? Something else happens. And so that's the transformation, right? But, it takes a great deal of consciousness and work. So this may be what you're talking about earlier. He says, you will also discover what your particular idealized self-image demands, right? So on that level, I think, yeah, and maybe in my earlier example, it would have, demanded that I was, somehow, a better or efficient person, right? Or knew more about, all of the, how to work with contractors and that sort of thing. It always it always wants us to know more, be more, than we really are. And that's where, the basic humility is to just kind of like, really, well, this is all I am. And then, I don't know, Dick, but you might find, to just be that real self would make you more attractive to people. And this is part of what the guide is promising. He says, the greatest gift we can give each other is to just show up in our real self, because everybody's trying to be, I don't know if you saw the email I sent, with that cartoon, of the projected idealized self-image. Let me see if I can bring it up here. I don't know. Maybe I'll do that at the end. But, it's like that creates, see me I'm special, and so other people might put you up on a pedestal, or they might want to tear you down from your pedestal, but they won't want intimacy.
They won't what?
Won't want intimacy. You can't get to intimacy there. You can't get to real connection, right? It's always, that's where we get into, trying to prove that we're okay. And that sometimes, the energy doesn't feel like people can, like relate to it so easily. And people that are equally, everybody's in some ways probably shyer than how they think they have to come off at some level, right? In social groups. And, it's an interesting journey. It reminds me, like, in group things, ceremonies and stuff, and Pathwork, I really like it because we can sit around and in a circle and everybody speaks and I can hear and take it in. And in party situations, or sometimes, after ceremony, people break up into, little groups talking to each other. And, I'm always aware, like, that, I look up and look around and everybody's already, paired up or whatever. And so, like, I'm kind of just standing there, well, and, it used to be, I guess, somewhat like troubling, like, and, feeling like, well, I better, I'm standing out here, but at this point, I don't understand it. It's always curious to me, but it feels okay. And oftentimes, like, my energy, takes me into starting to pick up the, be of service in the space, and then I reach out and talk to people and, have connection. And, it seems like it all still works, right? Even when I'm, not out there trying to get the attention that, and the approval, or, the validation. So part of it is, what are you seeking, inside? Like you're saying, you think that they won't, they'll leave you, but see if you can, why do you think, that they wouldn't like you as you are with your quieter self?
Yeah, no, God, I mean, I grew up with a very extroverted false self family, with all just,
Yeah.
Jekyll and Hyde in many ways. So it was very crazy making, but yeah, no. Yeah, and just being quiet and just allowing that, in a way, is for me jumping off a cliff. I mean, that is like,
Yeah,
thanks,
that is exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just feeling what happens and, what comes up for you, when you don't try to don the mask and put on that extra energy to stand out, right? And then just notice. And you might do that just for a little while. And then if you can't bear it anymore, go ahead and, put on the mask again. But it's a beautiful exploration, right? And that's how we get to understand and help transform ourselves.
Yeah,
and nothing in us is wrong, it all needs just to be accepted and loved. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, just to finish the thought, that when I've done that a few times, and I just stay with myself, like you were describing, oftentimes something just happens, like, oh, I want to move over here. I want to talk. If something speaks to me on this really soft level,
Exactly.
but I got to be willing to go into the jumping off.
Yeah, beautiful. That's exactly right, because that's when we can, when we get outside of that kind of, expectation and stuff, and are simply in our real self, that's where we do get guidance. That's where we are connected to our intuition. That is where we do know what we want and what our feelings are leading us into. And that's really how we need to navigate, right? And all of this time we've been trying to navigate by becoming this other false entity, in a sense.
And figure it all out, right?
Yeah. So great.
Can I just add?
Yeah, what else, Lucinda?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. It was interesting hearing, like, I need some glasses. I think it says Richard, Dick, what he had to say. Because I'm really the consummate extrovert, and I come from a mixed introvert extrovert family. And I find that when I'm not speaking, and when I'm listening, and when I'm kind of pulling back to let others do their thing, that's when I'm bombarded with, well, what's wrong with you? What's going on? And these kinds of things. And I really liked what you had showing about the end of the world, because what I find is that I've spent my life trying to do everything that was expected and what my family wanted, what my friends think I need to do, what, you know, all of these things. I've been in a very visible career that has a lot of people looking at what you do. And as I started to become really cemented in these middle years, and I want to do things that don't prescribe to these standards or what I'm supposed to do or whatever, it's becoming the end of the world for everyone around me.
Probably just what they need.
And it's very interesting. And, you know, just like Dick said about his family position, I'm an only child. I'm the oldest grandchild and niece and all of that, cousin. You know, I have an only child. And you operate in some different ways than people who come from family units that there's always someone around to bounce an idea off or to play with or to have unity with the parents and things like that. And so as I am older and I have to manifest all of these things that I've really been doing for a lifetime, everyone's pushing back on me. And so this whole true image and idealized images and all of these kinds of things, it's like, it's just a very interesting battle that I get to my middle ages and I'm finally like, okay, I've done it everybody's way for all of these years. And now I've kind of earned the right to do something different. And it's like, you would think that the world was ending.
And it is, you know, for them it is. And so there's a way that, you know, again, you know, this is wisdom and this is growth, and there is a temptation, you know, because others, you know, want us to stay the way we are, that, you know, we acquiesce in some way, right? You know, so growth takes a lot of courage, growth takes a lot of clarity inside of us, you know, because a lot of times we do have to step out of the, you know, all of the family dynamics, the cultural conditioning, you know, whatever. It's like we're going, you know, beyond that, and, you know, they're not going to like it. The other thing that I think is really useful to work with in this is, you know, everything in our life, the guide says, is basically like a dream, right? You know, he says everything we encounter is the outpicturing of our own inner landscape. And so if our outer landscape, you know, is looking like a bunch of people who are, you know, not wanting us to be doing what we feel called to do, you know, we have to read that as, oh, those are the unconscious parts of me I'm projecting out into the world. The unconscious parts of me that are speaking that voice that says, oh, you shouldn't, or that's risky, or what's wrong with you, or come back to, you know, this, right? Because oftentimes, you know, we have many voices inside of us, and there's, you know, the developing, you know, growth point, but it's moving against unconscious resistances inside of us. And oftentimes it's through projecting them out on other people that we learn, you know, that how to work with them, and also to recognize, oh, that's, you know, like, yes, that's what my mother says, but I also have a voice in me, you know, that somehow agrees with her. Because if she was mad at me and accusing me of, you know, having purple polka dots and pink hair or something like that, I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't react, because I would know, like, you're kind of like, you're not understanding, or you're not, you know, you're not even seeing the truth. So it's not me, you know, so I can just stay the course. But where somebody accuses us of something that we may accuse ourselves of, then we have an inner conflict, and we can't resolve the outer conflict until we resolve it inside. So that can be a useful way of working with those kind of dynamics in each other, in our families and stuff. Does that make sense? We have to, work with it in a session sometime, because I think that would be, more clear to you. But yeah.
Well, I sense that others here have been following these lectures and maybe been in these Zooms. But with all of the information that we're being presented, is there something that comes with like, okay, so here are 3 steps to help you work with this? Or, I'm just wondering, how does this all culminate in this session?
Right. So in this session, we're mostly working with the maps, right? And the overall understanding the guide is giving us, because it's a slightly different map. And it's, since the material was channeled, like there's a lot in the world that is reflecting this and saying similar things. So it's not quite as unique and unusual as it was, earlier in time. But it does give us a good way of sort of looking at what's really going on, and also how we're interpreting and telling the story. And there is other steps. The guide says to heal these things, right? It's like we have to actually, feel them. We can't figure them out. We have to feel them out. And most of us have been avoiding our feelings because that's part of the death and the unhappiness, right? And so we try with our idealized self-image to, prevent ourselves from having the feelings. And so he's suggesting that we kind of have to reverse course in that and learn how to be with ourselves, and navigate and go into the deep ocean of our feelings, and, find a larger, way of what he talks about, kind of re-educating the inner child, right? And discovering these different parts of us. So we do work with it all, and there is a process, but it's kind of not a very ABCs one, right? This is a kind of deep, and there are practices and basic, ways of and principles to work with, like, but it takes usually a while for people to begin to do it on their own. So a lot of times people work one-on-one with helpers for a while, read the lectures, maybe do some groups and that kind of thing. And we'll read into this, and maybe there'll be some more pieces that, we can, help you work with. But what I would say, like, one step, like you're saying, so I want to, go a different direction, but I'm getting all of this confrontation or resistance from my family. So what does that make you feel? Go inside and notice, what arises in you. It's like when they are resisting you, what happens inside of you. And sometimes we can feel like a constriction in our heart, or a tension in our belly, or a heaviness in our shoulders. And sometimes we have a thought form, that comes in, or, something that we're hearing ourselves say to ourselves. So doesn't have to be any one specific answer, but by going into the territory, which is yourself, right, you begin to bring the concepts into the inner universe and work with them there. So does that help a little? It's not always so simple of a, a lot of systems have a very kind of like, do this and do that. And this is more like you are the inner journey, right? And so we just, follow within you and notice what's arising in you. And then we, instead of run away from it, we, pay attention to it, and we, get curious and give it a voice and listen to what it feels like inside our body and all of those things. And as we do that, we learn more and more. And then we get to a place where we understand what we can do maybe to transform it. So see if he tells us anything more that might be useful along those lines. He says, let's now consider some of the general effects of the existence of the idealized self and some of the implications. Since the standards and dictates of the idealized self are impossible to realize, and yet you never give up the attempt to uphold them, you cultivate within yourself an inner tyranny of the worst order. You do not realize the impossibility of being as perfect as your idealized self demands. And you never give up whipping yourself, castigating yourself, and feeling a complete failure whenever it is proven that you cannot live up to its demands. A sense of abject worthlessness comes over you whenever you fall short of these fantastic demands and engulfs you in misery. The misery may at times be conscious, but most of the time it is not. Even if it is, you do not realize the entire significance, the impossibility of what you expect from yourself. And when you try to hide your reactions to your own failure, you use special means to avoid seeing it. One of the most common devices is to project blame for this failure onto the outer world, onto others, onto life. The more you try to identify with your idealized self-image, the harder the disillusionment whenever life brings you into a position where this masquerade can no longer be maintained. And it's true, some people are really good at sort of living up to their idealized self-image, right? And then some people are, not good at all. And it really sort of depends upon sort of the ego strength that they had developed prior to their, childhood wounding. Because if you get wounded early on before you have a lot of ego development, it's like you don't have the capacity to really live up at all to any projected, form of, maturity in that way, or perfection, and to come off looking good or whatever. If you were wounded after you had developed some ego strength, then you develop a capacity with your will to accomplish, and come off the way you think you should. And both of them have, problems. Like if you don't, you feel terrible and you always feel like you're always a failure and you have like a lot of low confidence and stuff like that. If you're really good at it, you may not recognize and you may have a sort of false sense of confidence, but it's not based on your real self at some level. And so eventually, it will, probably into, like if the tower will fall or something like that, and you will, come face to face to the areas that, you're still denying and trying to pretend and rise above, and then other times, there's a kind of, like you can kind of kill yourself, because you are good at it, and then you're always performing, and then it kind of sounds something maybe Lucinda where you're kind of moving beyond, like you were the only, like you had all this attention, so you become their entertainment, you become their performance, you become, all of the things that, and after a while, like, like, wait a minute, what about me? It's like, what do I want, and what am I, and so, it's a movement that sounds healthy, right? And to begin to, like, even though you're good at it and you can do it, to realize, well, maybe this isn't really who I am or what I want, right, for myself. And so we can, let go a little bit. And then, of course, yeah, the whole world is going to shake, and that's a part of this transformation, as our worlds are going to shake, right? And they have to, because the foundation is moving. So he says, like, the more we try to identify with our idealized self-image, the harder the disillusionment when life brings us into a position where this masquerade is not any longer maintained. He says, many a personal crisis is based on this dilemma rather than on the outer difficulties. It's like we think, oh, the world is falling apart. And in some ways it is, but what's really falling apart is this inner image mask of ourselves. And, it's that death that we're afraid So these difficulties then become an added menace beyond their objective hardship. The existence of the difficulties is proof to you that you are not your idealized self, you know, and that's kind of what happened in my story, you know, like we had outer world difficulties and all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, you know, in my mind is saying, well, I did the best I knew how, you know, but somehow it must not have been good enough because, you know, somehow it didn't work out. And there's a kind of perfectionism. And I know in my world, you know, like there is a flow, you know, to things, and I feel God's support, and you know, life is going well, you know, in the flow. But you know, so when that flow doesn't happen, it's probably good to question, right? But you know, like if what was going on was a deeper than a questioning, it was a kind of deep inner unconscious cringing inside of myself, you know, when I would think of the situation, and I could remember, you know, like where I spent a whole lifetime almost, you know, like in that state. So, you know, we begin to recognize these energetic signatures and then know, you know, how to work with them. And in this instance, you know, I was sort of busy, and so I didn't really take time to sit and process with it, although I could have, but I fundamentally knew it, you know, wasn't true. And if I kept myself going and, you know, move through, you know, that this one probably would, you know, not take me down for very long, you know, and not, it was like I was just dispelling it, right? Dispelling the untruth of it. And if there, you know, remains some after a little while, I'll go back inside and clear it, right? You know, because you can feel the difference when you're, you know, being attacked by your own self-image, and it's not fun. So, and we do it all the time unconsciously, and so we're used to living with it, you know, and this is where we don't even recognize, and that's what he's saying, we have to see the damage that this does, because it's just kind of like the ocean we live in, and it's all polluted with this stuff. But since we haven't ever known much else, you know, it's like we don't question it, except that we feel miserable, except that we have, you know, all this suffering and despair. And then eventually that, you know, as we seek, you know, hopefully we do, you know, find some ways, some truth, some, you know, ways of going beyond. So he says there are personality types who know perfectly well that they cannot identify with their idealized self-image, but they do not know this in a healthy way. They despair. They believe they ought to be able to live up to it. And their whole life is permeated with a sense of failure. While the farmer type experiences it only on more conscious levels when outer and inner conditions culminate in showing up the phantom of the idealized self for what it really is, an illusion, a pretense, a dishonesty. It amounts to saying, I know I am imperfect, but I make believe I am not. Not to recognize this dishonesty is comparatively easy when rationalized by conscientious, honorable standards and goals and a desire to be good. The genuine desire to better oneself leads us to accept the personality as it is now. So, you know, it's like we think we're improving ourselves, but if we are, you know, in this attempt to make ourselves become better than we currently seem to be at the moment, right, then we're doing some spiritual bypassing. We're jumping over some steps. And we don't have to worry that we're not going to make it, you know, because it's like the genuine desire is already within us. A lot of people feel like, well, if I don't have my idealized self-image, I wouldn't do anything good and positive, you know, and, you know, our higher self is deeper than that. And we really do want what's good and, you know, just and loving and all of that, right? So that is deep inside of us, and we can just trust that, and then notice that then there are these other aspects of ourself who, you know, feel like, you know, they have to perform or they have to be better than they are. So he says again, the genuine desire to better oneself leads to one to accept the personality as it is now. If this basic premise is the main governing force of your motivation for perfection, any discovery of where you fall short of your ideals will not throw you into depression, anxiety, and guilt, but will rather strengthen you. You will not need to exaggerate the badness of the trait in question, nor will you defend yourself against it with the excuse that it is the fault of others, of life or fate. You will gain an objective view of yourself in this respect, and this view will liberate you. You will fully assume responsibility for the faulty attitude. Be willing to take the consequences upon yourself. So going back a little bit to my, I think there was a part of me, like, I know I'm not great at this because I've not done it before, I'm kind of like feeling my way and trying to figure it out and trying to do the best I know how, but there is that, learning curve, right? And so then, I can assume responsibility maybe for, the fact that, I could have grounded it more, or I didn't, quite get that this could have happened, and I might have recognized it with some experience or something like that. But it's nothing to condemn myself for, nothing to judge myself for. It's like, it's just, we make a mistake and we learn. It's the learning curve, right? And maybe I can, ground it a little better next time. We're working. What's also true in this reality is many, many houses are being sold, and so all of these people are way swamped, right? And then you have this short amount of time that you can try to get them in there so that you can see what's there. So the system is like really fucked up, and so it puts everybody under a lot of pressure, and they feel bad, and so they're trying to say yes, and then they don't have time and can't show up, and and then makes you look bad, so there's all of these kinds of things. And when we don't take it personally, right? When we don't feel like shame for somehow not doing it perfectly, or it didn't work out perfectly, that's much more healthy, right? And much more like just humility, right? Pride and shame are two sides of the same coin. And the way that you kind of collapse and go into unity with those two dualistic, things is you find true humility, right? You recognize, well, I'm a child of God, and I'm a divine being, and I'm all fucked up, I've got a lot of parts of me that are confused, or, learning and growing. I'm only 2, or I'm young still. I'm still just, trying to figure all this out. And when we can have that humility and not feel like, well, we should already know everything, right? Then we can be a lot kinder to ourselves, and to our shortcomings, and to our failures. And that, is what the idealized self-image does, is anything but that. It becomes, angry at ourselves. It, tries to punish us. It gets frustrated with us. It beats on us, all kinds of things. So a sense of failure, frustration, and compulsion, as well as guilt and shame, are the most outstanding indications that your idealized self is at work. These are consciously felt emotions out of all those all those that lie hidden underneath. So these are the consciously felt. Okay. So yeah, and this is really true. Failure, frustration, and compulsion, guilt, and shame, are usually, strong indications. And this is part of what I'm saying is, you can learn your own inner signal, right? Like of when that idealized self is sort of beating on you in some way, because you can almost feel yourself cringing inside, or feeling bad somehow. Or maybe you're getting rebellious, or you're justifying and defending yourself, or something like that, right? In your inner dialogue. So the idealized self has been called into existence in order to attain self-confidence, and therefore finally happiness, pleasure supreme. The stronger its presence, the more genuine self-confidence fades away. Since you cannot live up to its standards, you think even less of yourself than you originally did. It is therefore obvious that genuine self-confidence can be established only when you remove the superstructure, which is this merciless tyrant, your idealized self. Yes, you could have self-confidence if the idealized self were really you, and if you could live up to these standards. But this is impossible, and since deep down you know perfectly well you are not that like what you think you are supposed to be, with this super self, you build up additional insecurity. and then further vicious circles come into existence. The original insecurity, which was supposedly whisked away by the establishment of the idealized self, steadily increases. It snowballs and becomes worse and worse. And I think this is what happened to me in my childhood. I had a really intense idealized self, and I was like really actively hated a lot of myself, through, a lot of my early journey, right? And all of my sessions, every time I would go to my helper, Susan would say, like, oh, there's your idealized self again. So we did years and years and years of work on the idealized self. And back then, I mean, I had no clue of how to, not let it be so, intensely dominant in my consciousness. So, in the journey, we have to learn and uncover our own unique way, but with the clues and the work of this. And as each one of us gets it right, when I sort of received the healing and the conscious, shift out of that very painful place, I did understand, that now I can be a conduit for that same healing, right? So, as we do our own healing, we're doing it for ourselves, but we're also doing it for the world. And then we can also serve the world later if we choose. But everything that is in me is in you, and so each time we're working this stuff, within ourselves, we're actually working it on the collective level.
Darlene?
So, yeah.
I would just like to say that I believe that my go-to mask is serenity.
Uh-huh.
But I wanted to ask you to explain the characteristics of the love mask.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
Behavioral characteristics of the love mask. Because I mean, I go into seclusion a lot, withdrawal a lot. What I don't believe I can control, because I do think I also have a healthy helping of the power mask, but what I don't believe I can control, I withdraw from. But I'm not sure about the love mask. So could you?
Sure.
Yeah.
And, I mean, maybe some of you all that recognize, that, and you can also chime in, but basically, the child is saying, well, if only I'm perfectly loving and good and, taking care of everybody and doing what they want me to, like reading their minds, to see how they want me to show up, right? So you're constantly sort of, submitting, that's the distortion of the divine quality of love is submission. And you're submitting, to try to be safe and to make sure that people are not angry with you. So you try to become what they want you to be.
Okay, I have a healthy helping of that too.
Exactly.
Just depends on what the situation is, which mask I'm going to wear.
I think we all have all three, and then maybe sometimes we have, like a go-to, and in some ways, it's often, well, we start with love and that doesn't work, and so then we go to power and that doesn't work, and so then finally we get to serenity because that's the last ditch,
Right.
out for us. So, but yeah, it's like we have all of them. So he says it's important to see how the vicious circle works. He's talking above, where the original insecurity, was supposed to be taken care of by the establishment of our idealized self, like then that insecurity snowballs because, we can't quite live up to who we think we should be, right? And so something is wrong with us and we feel less and less secure. And he says, we have to see how that vicious circle works, and we can't do that until and unless we become aware of the devious, subtle, unconscious ways in which this idealized self-image exists in each particular case. So, again, I don't know that exactly means that we have to like identify which mask. I mean, that can always be useful, right? But in each situation, where we feel sort of this inner pressure, this inner judgment, this inner critic, this inner, not good enough. It's kind of like it's the robber of our happiness. It's the cause of our dukkha, really our dissatisfaction. And it starts with our dissatisfaction with ourselves because we aren't who we think we should be to get everything we want. And we can't be. So we have to learn to like recognize that and hold that child that's consciousness demands, like to be safe, to be okay, I have to have everything the way I want it, or I'm, or I won't survive. And of course that was true in the original situation, right? That we needed these defenses, that we needed something we didn't get. But now we have to kind of go back in and tolerate that. Was somebody wanting to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that earlier the guy pointed to the fact that, there could be some blaming of life circumstances or even other people. But a lot of times we find ourselves attached to people we don't necessarily want to be attached to.
Some part of you doesn't, but some part of you must, since you are.
So, I guess so. But I mean, and it's not so easy to extricate these people.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very challenging. And sometimes, we don't know what it's about. It could be karmic, it could be other things, but it is, the self-responsibility is still there. And to maybe try to seek, like what is the challenge? Why is spirit, putting these people in a way, how are you unconsciously drawing this to you or making it worse by the way that you respond to it, right? Because ultimately I think self-responsibility is, not like, well, how are you manifesting it, and stop doing that, but more like, well, you're manifesting it. So now take responsibility and see what is the highest possible response you can offer to that circumstance and situation, right? And we can wrap our mind around it. Maybe we can't really pull it off, so we don't want to mask it or pretend, but to like ask that question, right, and see maybe if how I receive this and respond to it transforms, maybe something in the outer situation can transform. These are all cases very particular, that you can't judge, you just, okay, this is the puzzle on the blackboard, we have to try to solve it or work it through or understand it more because it's a mystery, right? And here I am stuck with this situation or this event, and I didn't want that, so, but here it is. And part of it is to, make that surrender and accept it, instead of resisting it and fighting it or judging yourself or judging others, because if we can receive it and accept it, then we can unravel it and move through it, I think, a lot quicker and gain something for the experience. Whereas otherwise we're just kind of like rattling around in the cage and making ourselves more and more frustrated and harmed in some way. So he says that there's a further and drastic result of the problem is a constant increasing estrangement from the real self. And this is, this was really true in my, experience as well, right? It's like when you judge and are frustrated with, how you show up or you have to keep showing up, in a way that doesn't really harmonize with your real self so that you can keep everybody happy, right? We disconnect from our deepest being. And oftentimes part of what I've been describing here is we actually turn against it, right? Because the real self is the one that's fucked up and sometimes makes the mistakes or doesn't do things exactly right. And so then the idealized self-image comes in and starts, wailing on the real self. And inside, we just kind of either get rebellious or close down, right, internally. And sometimes that can be in depression or, other things, but different people, everybody's unique with it, but I think all of us, work with this in various ways. So he says the idealized self is a falsity. Was somebody wanting to say something? Go ahead, Lucinda.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think it was Frank that said, you get to this point and you withdraw. And so I always thought about the withdrawing being like you've worn yourself out kind of thing, or you don't know what to do. And um, if you're expressive, you can feel like maybe you've talked the situation to death. And so now you have to do something else. And, you know, looking at this reading, it's like if you're trying to, um, it alone functions with all your capacities. The feelings are true and valid, even if they're not fully in truth and reality. It almost seems as though that withdrawal is trying to get all this stuff in alignment.
You know, there's different ways that you can talk about withdrawal. In this, we're talking about the mask of withdrawal, right? You know, so yes, there is strategic withdrawal, there is higher self, you know, like, okay, let's chill, let's just get present, let's stop, you know, the engagement or the active and go into the receptive mode, right? And there's a divine way of doing that. What we're talking about here is a withdrawal to not feel and in defense of, you know, it's a kind of cutting off. All aspects of the lower self go into separation. You know, sometimes the withdrawal can be a kind of a fuck you, or it can just be, you know, like, but it's a defensive withdrawal, right? You know, it's not a healthy boundary that says, okay, I need to take a break, or I want to be still inside, or something like that, right? So does that make sense?
It makes sense. I guess it's knowing which end of the pendulum you're on, whether
Right.
when the part where all of this is in conflict and you're pulling it in and reeling it in and trying to get the mask in order and all of this kind of thing, or whether you're still masked because you're still trying to be this other self and you're not really growing. You're just shutting people out because maybe they don't agree with you or
right.
And so, I mean, as we're going through this and different people are offering their ideas, I kind of see this as the retreat, kind of what I saw on the website, that, like you said, if we were all together, people would throw out different ideas and then group together and have chit chat and whatever. And so if we were in person and it was a weekend retreat and we had time and all of this kind of thing, I could see where we could all work on figuring some of this stuff out.
Right, and the Pathwork does group, you know, we have programs that are like that, you know, and we're going to have a community weekend at the end of July, 1st of August, that you could go and, you know, we've been in Zoom sort of mode right now, and I've got a couple of programs going. I don't have any new groups established, and this is kind of just an ongoing sort of come in when you want to. So, you know, it's one way. There's some other things that other helpers are offering as well. So, you know, I'll try to plug you in as we go, and you can maybe find a group. But we love to do this work in group and do it with each other. And then we also do it individually and go deeper inside, you know, and take these things and, you know, work with them on one-on-one with a helper. So, but yeah, you know, it's a great way of learning about ourselves and each other, and really learning, you know, kind of like the more we reveal, the more we understand and love and appreciate. And, you know, I love that part of the community aspect of the Pathwork. So am I hitting you right? Is that what you meant? You look a little puzzled. Okay.
But it's not always ideal.
Right, no. we let go of our idealized self
image. Not always ideal. You might have an idealized image of what a beautiful group experience might be. It's not always ideal.
In the group, we all show up in all of our real self, you know, including our, you know, monsters and our pettinesses and our, you know, like, so we get to, you know, be, explore all of the different aspects of us with each other. So it doesn't always look pretty in that way, but yeah, I think the ultimate result I like usually is a much deeper intimacy and awareness and love for each other. So that's what we aim for anyway. And as Frank says, sometimes it gets a little bumpy, but it's real, and it's vastly interesting and deep, and people are engaged in a deeper way. So, and if I do end up pulling together some, other Zoom group intro or know of one, I can, maybe direct you in that direction. Right now, I've got my hands full. I'm teaching two full classes. And so I'm kind of doing this in individual sessions, and I don't have another group starting right now, but some other helpers in the region may. There's some other lecture studies that you can get plugged into as well. So if you like this, we'll see if we can show you where to keep going and deepening. And, I think it would be great if you could make it up to 7 notes for that weekend, because, that's a way that you can really get a sense of the larger community and, what we do together and group stuff. So, okay, anything more? So I'm not sure where I left off. So yeah, so this increasing estrangement from our real self is, something that we don't recognize. And so the idealized self is a falsity. It is a rigid, artificially constructed imitation of a live human being. You may invest it with many aspects of your real being, right? And it does. It's not like, but we have to give energy to have it happen. And it robs us, of our real life force in creating this. So it remains an artificial construction. And the more you invest your energies, your personality, your thought processes, your concepts and ideas and ideals into it, the more strength you take from the center of your being, which alone is amenable to growth. The center of your being is the only part of you, the real you, that can live, grow, and be. It is the only part that can properly guide you. It alone functions with all your capacities. It is flexible and intuitive. Its feelings alone are true and valid, even if for the moment they are not yet fully in truth and reality, in perfection and purity. But the feelings of the real self function in perfection relative to what you are now, not being able to be more in any given situation of your life. The more you take out of that live center in order to invest into the robot you have created, the more estranged you become from the real self, and the more weakened and impoverished, the more you weaken and impoverish it. So you have sometime come upon the puzzling and frightening question, who am I really? And this is the result of this discrepancy and struggle between the real and false self. And only upon solving this most vital and profound question will your live center respond and function to its full capacity. And will your intuition begin to function to its full capacity? And will you become spontaneous, free of all compulsion? Will you trust in your feelings because they will have an opportunity to mature and grow? Feelings will become every bit as reliable as your reasoning power and your intellect. All this is final finding of self. Before this can be done, a great many hurdles have to be overcome. It seems to you that this is a life or death struggle, and you still believe you need the idealized self-image in order to live, survive, be happy. Once you understand that this is not so, you will be able to give up the pseudo-defense that makes the maintenance and cultivation of the idealized self seem necessary. And once you understand that the idealized self was supposed to solve the particular problems in your life above and beyond your need for happiness, pleasure, and security, you will come to see the wrong conclusion of this theory. Once you go a step further and recognize the damage the idealized self has brought into your life, you will shed it as the burden it is. No conviction, theory, or words you hear will make you give it up. But the recognition of what specifically it was supposed to solve, what damage it has done and is continuing to do, that will enable you to dissolve this image of all images So the guide talks that we have, we create many images, but the self-image is the image of all images. Needless to say, you also have to recognize most particularly and in detail what your specific demands and standards are. And further, you have to see their unreasonableness, their impossibility. And when you have a feeling of acute anxiety and desperation, consider the fact that your idealized self may be questioned and threatened, either by your own limitation, by others, or by life. Recognize the self-contempt that underlies anxiety or depression. When you are compulsively angry at others, consider the possibility that this is but an extension of your anger at yourself for not living up to the standards of your false self. Do not let it get away with using the excuse of outer problems to account for acute depression or fear. Those things are, like we can think, oh, something, what is the problem out there that's causing me to feel this way? But there may be an outer event, but it's the way that we've now interpreted it and we're in relationship to it with our idealized self. So only after you've made some substantial progress will you recognize that so many of these outer problems are directly or indirectly the result of the discrepancy between your capacities and the standards of your idealized self, and how you deal with this conflict. How are we doing? Okay? I think we have a little time left and a bit more to go. It always amazes me how much is in each lecture, and I just read it too, so we went through that. So, as you proceed in this particular phase of the work, you will come to understand the exact nature of your idealized self. And this is part of what you were referring to, Dick. And yeah, we do need to know it really well, but I think, sometimes conceptualizing it or, giving it a label is a little different than truly understanding it and feeling it. So oftentimes when I'm in a particular situation and I can feel this sort of, inner judgment and pressure on myself, I go in and I ask, okay, so, why are you accusing me, or what are you mad at me about, right? So I let that voice speak, and I know specifically, and usually once I hear what it's, up against, then I have, the clarity that recognizes, well, that's probably not realistic, or that's really, not something that, I can be in control of, and so then I try to, the idealized self is a defense and it's in fear. And so rather than pushing it away or judging the judge, right, what we have to do is embrace it. We have to recognize it and bring it into our hearts and bring truth and love to it. It was born out of fear and out of the lack of truth and love in our childhood somehow, right? And it's just trying to help us survive. And it doesn't know any better. It's young. It was developed at that age, and it kind of gets frozen at that age, and we develop and grow around it. And so now when we can begin to recognize that there's a more mature part of ourself that can go in and speak truth and help it transform. So when you make the very first steps towards giving up the idealized self, you will feel a sense of liberation as never before. Then you will be truly born again. Your real self will emerge. Then you will rest within your real self, centered within, and then you will truly grow, not only on the outer fringes that may have been free of the dictatorship of the ISI or idealized self, but wholly and fully free in every part of your being. This will change many things. First will come changes in your reactions to life, to incidents, to yourself and others. This changed reaction will be astounding enough, but little by little, outer things are also bound to change. So he's saying once our inner changes, and our reactions change, then actually, our manifestations begin to change. So our different attitude will have new effects. Overcoming your idealized self means overcoming an important aspect of the duality between life and death. At present, you're not even aware of the pressure of your idealized self, of the shame, humiliation, exposure you fear and sometimes feel, of the tension, strain, and compulsion. If you have an occasional glimpse of such emotions, you do not as yet connect them with the fantastic demands of your idealized self. Only after fully seeing these fantastic expectations and their often contradictory imperatives will you relinquish them. The initial inner freedom gained in this way will allow you to deal with life and to stand in life. You will no longer have to hold on frantically to the idealized self and, like that, stand, like we often talk about our feelings, or, I couldn't stand to feel that, or I can't stand that. And a lot of that is because we fear, like our real self, somehow it won't be sufficient and it feels like a death. But when we actually do let ourselves surrender into that, this is what he's giving us, all this promise, it really becomes beautiful. And then as long as we're kind of holding on and in the defense, it creates these vicious circles and the holding climates and difficulties in general. So as you proceed in this new phase of your work, you will sense and feel this inner tightness. And that's kind of what I'm talking about, like to really begin to feel it in the body. And gradually you will recognize the basic damage it causes. It makes the letting go of many an attitude impossible. It makes it unduly difficult to go through any change that would allow life to bring forth joy and a spirit of vigor. You keep yourself contained within yourself. And that's one of the things that I don't know if people feel, but, like the idealized self-image is kind of a constriction around us, right? And it, doesn't allow for spontaneity and freedom and impulsiveness. And, the inner child in us can't come out, right? We have to be a certain way. We have to be a certain way. So he says, words are insufficient. You have to sense rather what I mean. You will know exactly when you have weakened your idealized self by fully understanding its function, its causes and effects. Then you will gain the great freedom of giving yourself to life because you no longer have to hide something from yourself and others. You will be able to squander yourself into life, not in an unhealthy, unreasonable way, but healthily as nature squanders herself. Then and then only will you know the beauty of living. So continue your self-search out of these new considerations and do not be impatient if it takes time and relaxed effort. One more word. The difference between the real and the idealized self is often not a question of quantity, but rather of quality. And that's what I was talking about before. It's like a lot of times what the voice of the ISI says, it's like it's moral, it's correct, it has truth, right? It's more like in the tone, in the forcing current, in the, judgment or, threat of judgment that it contains. So it's in the original motivation, that we can feel the difference. So the higher self is loving us and helping us, and the other one is trying to control us and, judge us. So this will not be easy to see, but as you recognize the demands, the contradictions, the cause and effect sequences, the difference in motivation will gradually become clear to you. Another important consideration is the time element. The idealized self wants to be perfect according to its specific demands right now. The idealized self knows, the real self knows this cannot be. It knows that it is imperfect and it does not suffer from this fact. So to accept our imperfection, to accept sometimes the suffering that imperfection might cause in our lives, disadvantages or whatever, but, to not go into like it causes disadvantage or like block of flow or not everything, so, but we only suffer from it when we go into a judgment against it, right? And then we contract against a contraction And that, in a way, is a source of suffering. And so suffering is really something that we do to ourselves. Life has pain, life has difficulty, but it's only when we get involved in, our dukkha that suffering happens. So the real self is a complex of everything you are at the moment. Of course, you have your basic egocentricity. If you own up to it, you can cope with it. You can learn to understand it and therefore diminish it with each new insight. Then you will truly experience the truth that the more egocentric you are, the less self-confident you can be. The idealized self believes just the opposite. Its claims for perfection are motivated by purely egocentric reasons. And this very egocentricity makes self-confidence impossible. The great freedom of coming home, my friends, is finding your way back to the real you. The expression coming home has often been used in spiritual literature and teachings, but it has been much misunderstood. It is often interpreted to mean the return into the spiritual world after physical death, but much more is meant by coming home. You may die many deaths, one earth life after another, but if you've not found your real self, you cannot come home. You may be lost and remain lost until you do find the way into the center of your being. On the other hand, you can find your way home right here and right now while you are still in the body. When you muster the courage of becoming your real self, even though it would seem much less than the idealized self, you will find out that it is much more. And then you will have the peace of being at home within yourself. And then you will find security. Then you will function as a whole human being. Then you will have broken the iron whip of a taskmaster whom it is impossible to obey. And then you will know what peace and security really mean. And you will cease once and for all to seek them by false means.
Amen.
Amen. Yeah. So, and maybe we'll end there. There's some Q&As that he has here, but I didn't really find like a lot that was totally relevant. So, feel free to, sometimes it's fun just to look at all of the Q&As, and sometimes they're related to the lectures more than others, but he does address it to some degree. Let's see. Yeah, that's a question. Like, to what extent should humans take it upon themselves to punish a criminal, right? So these very interesting questions, not exactly relevant to exactly the lecture, but go ahead and take a look if you choose. And so anybody, any last comments, any more questions or chiming in here before we close?
I just love that last paragraph because it just sums it up so beautifully. So
Yeah, it really did. I agree.
yeah, thank you again for a beautiful presentation and gift to all of us, to me. Yeah, Darlene.
Thank you. You're welcome. And yeah, thank the guide and Eva for, the original transmissions. But yeah, the more we can kind of steep ourselves in these, we try to become living lectures, right? They kind of integrate and, so, hopefully it helps. I know when I first started reading these lectures, it's like I would just kind of fuzz out and I couldn't even remember what I was reading after I read it. So
You know that feeling,
you know that feeling, yes. So, and sometimes it still happens too, but yeah, these are transmissions, right? So they also are energetic, and so hopefully, people can receive something tonight. And the guide is also blessing us. He says, "Now, my dearest ones, each one of you receive the love of the guides. Receive our love, our strength, and our blessings. Be in peace. Be in God." Okay. Well, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks, and thanks for joining. And if anybody wants to connect in between, send me an email. We can continue with this work. Okay. Take care.
Darlene.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Darlene. Have a good night.
Adios all.
Night.
Thank you.